Male and female, right? Well, not according to biology. Today, I'll give you the neuroscientist guide to sex and gender, including why my cat Boots is both male and female. So, as a drug scientist who studies things like sex differences and drug use, this is honestly one of my favorite topics. And y'all have been asking me to talk about this for a bit. So, hopefully, by the end of this, you will see just why I find this topic, sexual differentiation, to be one of the most fascinating topics. Now, just as a warning, this is very simplified. So, if you're a biologist out there who's like, but yes, that is 1,000% true. There are tons of other steps that I didn't get to, but you just need to understand the very basics to get to the more complicated side of things. So, we're doing the basics today. We're also not talking about sexual orientation here. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. Gender is the social construct, which includes the culture that you live in. So you could be male, female, you could be Hydra, you could be two-spirit. It all depends on where you live and which culture you participate in. And sex is just the reproductive organ. So they're all kind of different, but they're all lumped together weirdly all at the same time. Now let's get to the fun part, the chart. So we commonly talk about people as being male or female, and that is it. And in the idea of biological sex, that is not the only category. So you have male, you have female, and then you have intersex. And intersex is basically when people don't match all of the characteristics of what you would consider male according to reproductive organs or what you would consider female. Now the interesting part here is that you can have a combination of various kind of statuses. So you can have chromosomally, you would be male, but then internally and externally, you might be female. So you might have those organs be more similar to the kind of female version of things. And so when I talk about this, I talk about the chromosomal sex. So if you're XX or XY, I talk about things like the internal female genitalia. So do you have things like a uterus? And then I talk about the external female genitalia. So things like the vulva. So the chart is here to show you how you can either become male, female, or intersex. And as a reminder, this is most mammals. This is not true of all animals. But for example, I had an intersex cat. Boots was her name. She recently passed last week, actually. But she was, we think, both male and female. So let's start with chromosomes. You can have XX, which is typically female. You can have XY, which is typically male. And then you could also have a variety of other chromosomes. So you could just be an X alone. You could have XXY or XYY. You could have XXYY. And all of those would be considered intersex. So even when it comes down to chromosomes, we don't just have male, female. We have male, female, and intersex. Now, the Y chromosome is given by the father, which is why they say that males actually determine what the offspring is going to be, male or female, because if they give the Y chromosome, then the offspring is male. If they give the X chromosome, then the offspring is female. And once you start down these paths, it's kind of one direction or another, but things can change in the middle of this path. So if you start down, let's go down the female path. And we start down the female path first because it is kind of the default. And I say kind of because there's a lot of controversy about this right now, and I'm not going to go into it at the moment. But in general, what we see is that without a Y chromosome, that fetus is going to become XX, is going to become female. So it's going to go down that female path. Now, it is still an active path, so there are things that the body has to do to be able to continue to further develop things like the uterus. But it seems like it is more of the default. And so on the chart, you can kind of follow along with this pretty easily. So you have the XX chromosome that leads to the development of an ovary, which leads to the production of estrogen, and then that leads to the internal female genitalia. So it's kind of this very linear track. Yes, ovary leads to estrogen, which leads to that Mullerian duct, which is internal female. Now, the male side has kind of a mirrored version of this, but there are two kind of extra things that go along with this. So on the male side, you see that the Y chromosome leads to the SRY gene to be expressed, and the SRY gene will start kind of, again, that mirror of that process. So what will happen is that SRY gene will lead the testis to be kind of further developed, and that leads to the production of testosterone, and that leads to the development of those internal male genitalia, so things like the vas deferens. And so with that, what you get is kind of that same track of testosterone to the Wolffian duct. But But there's a couple of additions here. So first, testosterone has to be converted into dihydrotestosterone. When it's converted into dihydrotestosterone, that leads to the kind of external male genitalia being developed, so things like the penis. And then the male side also has to turn off the female side. And so the testis will actually produce what is known as AMH, which stands for anti-Mullerian hormone. Like, its job is to turn off the Mullerian ducts from the female side. And that's another reason why we consider it kind of the default. So the male side has to become male, but also has to turn off the female side. And the female side doesn't require like the conversion to actually produce the external female genitalia. That's just kind of like naturally produced from the beginning. Then the male side kind of comes along with testosterone and dihydrotestosterone and converts that into that male side. So the like primordial clitoris becomes a penis then, basically. Which sounds like something out of a natural history textbook, and I'm not against that. Those are the basics, but here are the actual fun thought experiments that you start to see coming out of this. Okay, so first, chromosomally, we know that we can have different versions of intersex. Now, when we start going down this chart specifically on the male side, look at how many different places things could change here. So what if like the male was insensitive to testosterone here? So what if it's an XY chromosome and you go down and they're insensitive to testosterone? In this case, you won't get the internal male genitalia that are being formed. Since you don't have testosterone, you also don't get the external male genitalia. But on the same side, you still are getting production of the thing that's turning off the female side. You are neither male nor female. You don't have a full working set of either versions of those reproductive organs. Or what about if AMH dysfunction somehow? So in that case, you are XY chromosomally male. You still have testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, so you have internal and external male genitalia. But if AMH stops working, then you also still have internal female genitalia. Then think of all of the combinations that this chart gives you. And that's what I want you to understand from this video, is that like we have this category of intersex and we have these categories of male and female. Male and female what? Chromosomally, internally, externally. And what does intersex mean? Because it can mean so many different things. It could mean somebody who appears to be female but might be chromosomally male. And this diversity is a beautiful, fascinating thing. So it's seen in humans and cats and dogs and all sorts of animals. And it shows us that biology is just a spectrum, like pretty much everything else in this world. And y'all, that's what makes the world we live in and us so genuinely interesting. So let's like enjoy the spectrum of differences we see. And when somebody asks about sex or gender, be like, okay, but what are you talking about here? Maybe open up their eyes to just how fascinating it can be.